Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are opening up a stack of sources that deals with a really profound systemic failure in legal systems across America. And it's a failure that is particularly stark in Tennessee. We are talking about the long overdue legal recognition of coercive control.
This is a deep dive into what we call the invisible architecture of abuse. It really is. It's this pattern of domination and psychological captivity that survivors have experienced and researchers have documented for decades. Yet in states like Tennessee, the legal framework essentially refuses to name it. It leaves the very foundation of abuse structurally invisible to the courts.
That invisibility. That is the core problem we're tackling today, isn't it? Our sources lay out a crucial contrast. While survivors in Tennessee are sort of trapped in this outdated, incident-based legal system that demands a bruise or a visible assault, a coalition of forward-thinking states, and we're talking about California, Connecticut, Hawaii, Massachusetts, and Washington, they've already modernized their domestic violence laws to address this head-on. They've written the blueprint.
And the chasm between the lived reality of abuse in Tennessee and what the law currently defines as abuse it's just profound. As our source material repeatedly emphasizes, that silence from the legislature isn't merely academic. It's not procedural. It is lethally dangerous. It costs lives. It destroys families by undermining safety and stability, and it leaves thousands of survivors trying to navigate their trauma without the essential legal recognition they need, to secure protection and ultimately their freedom.
So our mission in this deep dive is structured and clear. We need to break down the essence of coercive control, what it looks like, how it actually operates.
Okay.
Then we'll detail exactly what those forward-thinking states did to define it in concrete legal terms. We'll expose why the current gap in Tennessee's law is so fundamentally dangerous. And finally, we will provide the 6 explicit steps necessary for the state to modernize its statutes to really catch up to the 21st century.
And if there is one essential insight to carry with you throughout this entire discussion, it is this. The old legal model, the one obsessed with proving a single visible incident, a punch, a threat, a documented injury, it's not just insufficient. It is structurally incapable of addressing the system of psychological domination that characterizes the vast majority of abuse. For true prevention, for lasting protection, the law must stop looking for the isolated moment and start recognizing the pervasive, cumulative pattern.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when most people, or certainly when the legal system, think about domestic violence, they zoom in on a single isolated moment, right?
Yeah.
Visible fight, an assault, a moment where the police were called. But our source material insists that we have to shift our lens. Coercive control is not a moment. It's a system, a calculated strategy.
That distinction is absolutely paramount. Coercive control is not a single argument or a single outburst of anger. Though those elements, they may certainly be used strategically within the system. It is a methodical, systematic campaign of behavior designed for one purpose: total domination. The abuser employs this steady, unrelenting strategy to systematically strip away the victim's autonomy, their liberty, and eventually their entire sense of self, and often without leaving a single visible mark.
I think the language used by experts who study this is so compelling because it really captures the internal experience. They describe this phenomenon, this control that operates without physical barriers, as captivity in plain sight.
That phrase, captivity in plain sight, it perfectly encapsulates the paradox of coercive control. Outwardly, the survivor might appear fine. They go to work, they run errands, they interact with friends. But internally, their movements, their decisions, their thoughts, their interactions are entirely constrained by the invisible architecture of the abuser's demands. They are not physically locked up, but their agency, their free will, has been stolen.
And the cost of that theft is just staggering. Survivors themselves often describe the emotional journey as losing yourself without realizing when it happened. That must feel like a slow, terrifying disorientation.
It is precisely that. It's a methodical erosion. You don't wake up one Tuesday morning and find you've been completely stripped of your identity, no. You wake up having made 1,000 small accommodations, avoiding certain friends, canceling plans, changing what you wear, hiding your phone. Each small step is managed and monitored until, cumulatively, the victim is effectively confined within the boundaries the controller has set. And this is a crucial insight we have to keep coming back to. For many survivors, the psychological captivity, the feeling of losing their mind and their sense of self, was far worse and more enduring than any physical harm.
That's a really challenging insight for a legal system built on physical evidence to process. So we need to detail the specific patterns that constitute coercive control, because we have to make this invisible cage visible. What are the key behaviors we need to be looking for according to the sources?
We have to look for the pattern, the repetition, and the fact that these behaviors are cumulative. They cross domains. This is not just one domain of life. It's finances, it's social life, it's movement. It's your very appearance.
So let's start at the beginning of the cycle, which seems almost universal in these cases. Isolation.
Isolation is the necessary precursor for almost all subsequent abuse. It really is. It's the strategic cutting off of the victim from any potential source of objective support or affirmation, friends, family, colleagues, even faith communities. If the victim has no outside voice affirming that their reality is real, the controller's voice becomes the dominant, unchallenged authority. The goal is maximum dependence, making the victim believe they have nowhere else to go, and the abuser often accomplishes this by creating conflict, fabricating rumors, or just making it impossible or punishing for the victim to see other people.
And once that isolation is established, the regulation of life begins. And now it's often facilitated by technology, right? Monitoring and surveillance.
Absolutely. This is a 21st century evolution of control. It's the pervasive use of technology to remove any last vestige of private space. This involves obsessive monitoring of phones, tracking devices placed in cars, reading private messages, demanding passwords, or constantly monitoring social media activity. The source material refers to this explicitly as a hallmark of modern coercive control. When a person is constantly surveilled, they are always on stage. They're always performing for the abuser, even when the abuser is physically absent. It removes the ability to think an independent thought.
Next is the creation of economic dependence, and this can happen regardless of who is bringing in the income. Financial control.
This is often the strongest chain used in the cage. It is forced financial dependence, pure and simple, even if the victim is a highly paid professional. Control can manifest as, deprivation of necessities, preventing access to basic food, medication, or transportation needed for work. Or it can involve total minute-by-minute control over every single dollar spent. The abuser might prevent the victim from having bank accounts in their own name, ruin their credit, or force them to ask permission for the smallest purchase. The outcome is always the same. The victim lacks the independent means to leave, and they often cite the financial impossibility of escape as the greatest barrier.
And that compliance is enforced through threats.
Intimidation is the fuel for the compliance engine, and crucially, these are often strategic threats that fly right under the legal radar of assault. The abuser realizes that physical threats against the victim might cross the legal threshold too soon. So the most effective threats are often directed against the victim's deepest vulnerabilities. Threats against children, threats to expose private information, threats to harm or give away beloved pets. By capitalizing on these vulnerabilities, the abuser forces compliance without having to resort to physical assault.
This pattern then just trickles down into the micro details of existence, the regulating of daily life.
This is where the pattern becomes truly granular and pervasive. It's the abuser dictating what someone wears, controlling their sleep schedule, deciding who they are permitted to talk to, or even what they are permitted to eat. This constant, exhausting regulation ensures that the victim's mental energy is entirely consumed by the effort to comply and appease. There is no mental bandwidth left for self-care, for maintaining resilience, or critically, for planning an exit strategy. It chips away at autonomy, one tiny, seemingly insignificant decision at a time.
And that's coupled with this sustained assault on self-esteem, humiliation, and degradation.
These actions are designed to dismantle the victim's self-worth, to make them believe they are fundamentally flawed, worthless, or incapable of functioning independently. This can involve public embarrassment, persistent put-downs, ridiculing their appearance or intelligence, or forcing them to perform demeaning acts. When the victim internalizes this belief that they deserve the treatment they are receiving, their ability to seek or accept outside help is severely compromised.
And finally, the ultimate form of psychological warfare. And we really need to slow down on this one because it's a term often used casually in conversation, but in this context, it is utterly destructive. Gaslighting.
You are absolutely right to pause here. Gaslighting is not just lying. It is a systematic, aggressive denial of the victim's reality until the survivor begins to doubt their own memory, their senses, and even their sanity.
So it's not just, I didn't say that. It's much deeper than that, isn't it? It's rewriting the shared history.
Exactly. It's you are imagining that entire conversation. You must be mentally unwell. You have always been prone to hysterics. The abuser creates two layers of reality. The true reality the survivor experienced, and the false, distorted reality the abuser insists is true. So if the abuser denies something the victim remembers clearly, the victim is forced to choose. Either the abuser is lying, or my own mind is failing me. Over time, especially when you're isolated, the victim learns to mistrust their own perception, and that is paralyzing.
It effectively removes the foundational trust you need to live independently. If you can't trust what you saw or heard, how can you trust yourself to make the life-altering decision to escape?
Precisely. That distrust in self is the key to maintaining the captivity. So this detailed list we've just gone through, isolation, monitoring, financial control, humiliation, gaslighting, it shows why coercive control is pattern-based and cumulative. The old legal model demands a visible injury or a single provable event. But if a Tennessee judge is only looking for that one big incident, they miss this entire invisible, systematic architecture of capture.
That structural gap brings us directly to the problem state, Tennessee. Our sources they're unambiguous in their assessment. Tennessee's legal definition of domestic violence is profoundly outdated. It's operating, as one source notes, like it's stuck in 1985. And it lacks the mechanisms to recognize the pattern we just defined.
The current Tennessee framework relies almost exclusively on three very narrow criteria: clear physical injury, a credible threat of physical injury, or proving a single distinct provable incident that crosses a high threshold, typically stalking or assault. So if a survivor walks into a Tennessee courthouse today with overwhelming evidence of systematic isolation, financial bondage, and constant surveillance, that narrative, while perfectly aligned with modern definitions of coercive control, often just doesn't fit the statutory boxes required for an order of protection.
What are the real, concrete, and deeply harmful consequences of operating with this massive legal gap?
The consequences are tragically practical. They impact safety and freedom across the board. The most immediate outcome is that survivors experiencing profound psychological captivity, those who are completely controlled, terrorized, but perhaps have not yet been physically harmed, they cannot obtain legal protection. They are deemed legally safe or not abused when in fact they are facing an extremely high-risk situation.
And how do courts currently classify these detailed, pattern-based narratives of control when they're presented without physical evidence?
They frequently misclassify them. This is often minimized in court as relationship conflict.
Just a bad relationship.
Exactly, two people who simply don't get along, or high-conflict divorce issues. When the judge lacks the statutory framework to identify the systematic campaign of control as abuse, they treat it as an argument between equals. This minimizes the actions into something transactional or mutual, rather than recognizing a dominant submissive power imbalance designed to terrorize, impoverish, and immobilize.
So if the law minimizes the control, then the abuser knows exactly where the legal limit is. They are free to continue escalating right up to the line of physical harm.
That is the most dangerous consequence. The legal system, by not recognizing the pattern, essentially grants abusers a license to escalate for years. These perpetrators understand the legal thresholds intimately. They know they can isolate their victim, bankrupt them, monitor them 24/7, and terrorize them emotionally right up to the legal line of a physical threat. And the court remains legally blind to their systemic campaign of abuse. They use the law's blindness as a tool of the abuse itself.
And we have to emphasize how this invisibility extends into family law. Protective orders are one thing, but custody decisions carry generational consequences.
This is devastating. Children remain in unsafe custody arrangements because the pattern of coercive control, the isolation of the other parent, the threats against them, the emotional abuse, is legally invisible to the statute. If the law fails to recognize non-physical domination as abuse, then the family courts cannot properly assess the immense risk the controlling parent poses to the children's long-term safety and well-being. Abuse of a parent is child abuse, but the law fails to connect those dots.
So in summary, Tennessee treats domestic violence as a single visible moment, rather than recognizing it as a systemic, calculated campaign of capture. And that means survivors must literally wait for the physical violence to occur, increasing their risk, just to access basic legal protection.
It's a perverse and dangerous legal requirement. The law forces the victim into greater peril just to satisfy an outdated evidentiary standard. Modernization requires recognizing the danger inherent in the pattern itself, regardless of whether a punch has been documented.
And here is where the contrast becomes so vivid, because the best way to understand a legal failure is to look at a detailed real-world case where a judge's hands were tied. Our sources point directly to a pivotal case in Massachusetts, prior to their 2024 reform, which serves as a perfect alarming parallel to Tennessee's current situation.
This Massachusetts case is just an enduring lesson in legislative inadequacy. The woman who came before the court seeking a restraining order did not fit the legal definition of abuse. She had no bruises, no recent documented assaults, and no explicit threat of imminent physical harm. Her case rested entirely on the overwhelming, methodical, invisible pattern of coercive control.
Let's step through the facts of her case slowly, because they bring the definition of coercive control we outlined earlier to agonizing life. What did her state of psychological captivity actually look like?
It was total control. She detailed her isolation. She had been systematically cut off from all friends and family until she was completely dependent on her abuser for her social reality and objective advice. Financially, he maintained total control, ensuring that she could not make any independent purchase or plan, forcing her to rely on his permission for survival.
The monitoring must have been constant.
Relentless. Extensive monitoring and surveillance was a central feature of her abuse. Her phone, her car, her messages, her schedule, everything was tracked, recorded, or questioned. She could not move or speak without the fear of immediate and severe consequences.
And he controlled her appearance and her daily itinerary.
Absolutely. The controller dictated what clothes she was permitted to wear, where she was allowed to go, and exactly what her daily schedule would be. She was living under continuous regulatory control. Clinical experts who reviewed her situation confirmed she was living in a sustained state of psychological captivity and profound danger.
And the heartbreaking failure here is the paradox of the judicial outcome. The judge in the case heard her testimony, believed her testimony, and recognized the pattern of danger and abuse. Yet the restraining order was denied.
This is the moment where the rigidity of the law collides with human reality. The judge's moral compass and understanding of human safety recognized the abuse instantly. But the then-current Massachusetts statute mandated that abuse meant physical harm or explicit threats of physical harm. Because her detailed narrative of psychological domination, financial capture, and isolation lacked that specific legal trigger, the judge had to state on the record that she did not meet the legal definition of abuse. The law left the judge no choice but to deny her protection.
That judicial denial, that moment of systemic failure became the turning point. It publicly demonstrated that if the abuse was non-physical, the law was blind, regardless of the imminent danger the victim faced.
It galvanized the legislative body. Lawmakers realized they were actively, legislatively failing survivors who were caught in the most common and often precursor form of domestic violence. The response, thankfully, was swift and decisive. Massachusetts updated its domestic violence framework in 2024 to explicitly include coercive control as a recognized form of abuse, choosing to close that legal hole with urgency.
And this brings us back to Tennessee with an alarming clarity. If that Massachusetts survivor walked into a Tennessee court today with that same evidence, the isolation, the financial control, the constant monitoring, what would the outcome be?
It would be identical. The parallel is perfect and profoundly urgent. The Tennessee statute lacks the necessary language to recognize and address this sophisticated pattern of abuse. A Tennessee judge, no matter how sympathetic, no matter how much they recognize the severe danger the victim is in, would be legally required to deny the protection order because the pattern remains invisible to the statute. That survivor is unprotected, exposed, and forced to wait for the physical violence that the pattern predicts.
That moment of human failure, the judge knowing the truth but being forced by the text of the law to deny safety, that is the real driver for legislative change. And it underscores why this modernization is not an academic exercise. It is an immediate public safety requirement. The good news is that Tennessee is not being asked to innovate in a vacuum. The blueprint for modernization already exists in multiple states that have successfully closed this gap. Let's look at what the modern states have done, starting with California and their SB 1141 amendment.
California's approach, amending the Domestic Violence Prevention Act, is foundational. The key philosophical shift in their definition centers on unreasonable interference with a person's free will and personal liberty. By framing it this way, they shift the focus away from physical injury and toward the systematic destruction of autonomy. The law recognizes that a person's liberty is under attack even without physical constraint.
So what was the primary legal impact of adopting that specific liberty-focused definition?
The ability to issue protective orders solely on the basis of coercive control. Before, coercive control evidence might be used to bolster a physical violence claim. Now, it can stand alone as the foundation for the order. This allows for intervention at the earliest stages of the pattern, before the physical violence, sexual assault, or legal threat manifests. Crucially, the law becomes proactive.
Okay. Next, we move to Connecticut's Public Act 21 as 78. This is often cited as one of the strongest national definitions, largely due to its clarity on intent.
Connecticut's law is exemplary because it covers all the bases. They define coercive control as a pattern of behavior that in purpose or effect interferes with free will and personal liberty. That language, purpose or effect, is incredibly powerful in a legal context.
Okay, let's unpack that technicality for the listener, because that sounds like legal jargon. How does a prosecutor or an attorney prove purpose versus effect in court? And why does having both options matter so much?
That's a critical question regarding evidentiary standards. Proving purpose means proving the abuser's state of mind that they intended to strip the victim of liberty. That's notoriously difficult. You'd need evidence like text messages explicitly saying, I control your money so you can't lose, or video evidence of them laying out their plan to dominate.
Which abusers are rarely foolish enough to provide.
Exactly. But proving effect is far more straightforward and rests entirely on the victim's testimony and objective evidence. For example, if the victim demonstrates through bank records and testimony that they have zero access to shared funds, that they are isolated from all family, and that they cannot leave the house without permission, the effect of that pattern is clearly the stripping of liberty and free will. The court doesn't need to know why the abuser did it, they just need to see the result of the domination. This purpose or effect dual standard dramatically lowers the evidentiary burden for the survivor.
And their application is also broader, integrating this definition across the entire court system.
Correct. The Connecticut definition applies comprehensively to protective orders, custody disputes, and other family court proceedings, ensuring the concept is internalized across the judiciary. Furthermore, they include a detailed, non-exhaustive list of specific examples: isolation, deprivation, monitoring, which removes ambiguity and ensures judges and police officers have clear, specific statutory guidance.
Hawaii's statute, HRS Section 586U01, uses perhaps the most evocative language, focusing almost philosophically on the goal of the abuse itself.
Hawaii's framework zeroes in on the psychological destruction. Their definition focuses explicitly on actions that strip away a person's liberty, freedom, and sense of self. They articulate the mechanism of capture very clearly, making the person dependent through isolation, financial control, and systematic surveillance. By using strong, actionable language like threatening, humiliating, or intimidating actions, Hawaii establishes that the act of domination is the offense, making the resultant injury secondary to the systematic control.
And of course, Massachusetts, which we discussed earlier, made its post-2024 update a legislative priority after that failure.
Massachusetts modernized their framework in direct response to that high-profile judicial failure. They chose to integrate coercive control as a recognized form of abuse, essentially mirroring the robust, pattern-based approach of California, Connecticut, and Hawaii. Their reform proves that even in states with historically strict legal definitions, legislative change can happen swiftly when the practical failure of the old law is irrefutable.
Finally, Washington State offers a slightly different perspective on integration, showing that legal culture matters just as much as specific words.
Washington is fascinating because their entire domestic violence system was already built around the philosophy of patterns, not incidents, long before the term coercive control became common statutory language. While they may not have isolated the specific term as a standalone criminal offense, their civil courts routinely and robustly treat this systematic pattern of domination, the financial abuse, the stalking, the emotional terrorism, as central to domestic violence proceedings. This highlights that judicial training and institutional recognition of the philosophy of pattern abuse are paramount.
So if we look at this blueprint, Tennessee has access to specific statutory definitions that cover liberty, intent, and effect, and it has models for application in protective orders and custody. The solution isn't inventing, it's adopting.
Exactly. The path is well lit. The only barrier left is a matter of political will and the willingness to acknowledge the decades of psychological and emotional abuse that have been deemed legally invisible under the current 1980s-era statutes.
Okay, let's shift this detailed analysis into a clear roadmap for the listener. For Tennessee to update its statutes, we need a comprehensive approach that targets both the legal definitions and the systemic application across the entire judicial process. So what are the 6 explicit steps necessary to close this legal gap?
This must be a comprehensive legislative package. A half measure will just be misinterpreted and rendered ineffective.
Step 1, the necessary foundation. Update the definition of domestic abuse.
This is the core legislative change. We have to add coercive control as a recognized statutory form of abuse within the Tennessee Code. The specific language should be adopted from the blueprint states, defining coercive control as a pattern of behavior that in purpose or effect unreasonably interferes with a person's free will, liberty, safety, or sense of self. Without this explicit pattern-based language, we will continue to rely on incident-based metrics that fail survivors.
Step 2 is giving the courts the practical tools to apply this new philosophical concept. Include a non-exhaustive list of examples.
A simple, broad definition risks being watered down or ignored by judges accustomed to hard physical evidence. As we saw in Connecticut and Hawaii, a non-exhaustive list provides essential mandatory guidance. This list must explicitly detail the core elements of the pattern: isolation, systematic monitoring, complete financial control, strategic threats, including against children and pets, humiliation, regulating daily life, and depriving necessities. And critically, it must include tech-enabled surveillance, grounding the law firmly in the reality of 21st century digital monitoring.
Step 3, the immediate protection mechanism. Apply it to orders of protection.
This is where the life-saving impact begins. It must be made explicit that survivors can obtain a binding court order solely on the basis of the coercive control pattern before physical violence is inflicted or required. This shifts the state's focus from managing injuries after the fact to preventing the injury in the first place. If a survivor can prove the pattern of capture, they get the order. It interrupts the abuse cycle before lethal escalation occurs.
Step 4 deals with the long-term safety and well-being of the next generation. Apply it to custody decisions.
This is a massive reform necessity. Coercive control frequently escalates when parents separate, and they often use children as levers of control. The law must mandate that courts consider coercive control as a serious risk factor and a form of abuse when making decisions regarding child custody, visitation, and parental responsibility. If a parent is a proven coercive controller, the court must recognize their fundamental inability to prioritize the child's best interest over their own need for domination.
Now, we have to address Step 6, which is about prioritization. Step 6 is listed as explore criminalization. But if the pattern is so dangerous, if it predicts homicide, shouldn't criminalization be Step 1? Why prioritize the civil forms first? What's the practical downside of immediate criminalization?
That is the right challenge to raise. While the emotional and public desire is to immediately criminalize behavior that is clearly terrorizing, there are profound and immediate practical and constitutional barriers. Civil law operates on a much lower burden of proof preponderance of the evidence. You only need to show something is more likely than not to be true to gain a protective order.
And criminal law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
Exactly. And proving a pattern of non-physical behaviors, isolation, gaslighting, financial control, beyond a reasonable doubt to satisfy a criminal statute is extremely complex. An immediate criminalization bill risks being challenged and overturned as unconstitutionally vague, or it risks requiring evidentiary standards so high that almost no prosecutor can meet them, making the law toothless.
So by prioritizing the civil path, steps 1 through 5, you give survivors immediate protection using a lower, more achievable evidentiary standard while simultaneously training the judicial system.
Precisely. The civil system provides immediate safety and establishes a legal culture of recognizing the pattern. Once the courts, police, and attorneys are trained and comfortable with the pattern recognition in the civil context, then the state can pursue criminal statutes that target the pattern of behavior itself. Rather than relying solely on existing inadequate criminal harassment or assault charges, it's a necessary two-stage process.
Which brings us to step 5, which really underpins the success of all the other steps. Provide essential training.
This is where reforms so often stumble due to lack of allocated resources. Even the best written law is useless if judges, law enforcement officers, and child welfare professionals don't understand how to apply it. They must be thoroughly trained, not just on the definition, but on recognizing the pattern in practice. And crucially, they must be trained to clearly distinguish a pattern of systematic domination from mutual conflict. If they can't differentiate a strategic campaign of capture from two people arguing, the new law will be minimized, misunderstood, and rendered ineffective.
The roadmap is detailed, practical, and it's grounded in the success of other states. The next question is simply, when Tennessee chooses to stop pretending that abuse only requires a visible bruise.
The time for incremental change has long passed. This demands comprehensive action.
We've established the failure, and we've provided the solution. Now let's reconnect this detailed legal discussion back to the ultimate, human stakes. Why did this modernization matter beyond just fixing a legal definition?
It matters because we have to return to the central thesis. Coercive control is the foundation of domestic violence. Physical violence is merely the enforcement mechanism the abuser uses when the psychological control begins to slip, or when the victim finally tries to escape. If you dismantle the foundation, the control, the isolation, the financial dependence, you remove the conditions necessary for the violence to thrive. You stop the process before it reaches its lethal conclusion.
And by maintaining the current outdated model, what crucial warnings is Tennessee actively ignoring?
They are ignoring four things that are critical for public safety and survivor freedom. First, they are ignoring the early predictable warning signs of escalating violence. Abusers don't jump straight to physical assault. They begin with a pattern of isolation and monitoring. Legal recognition allows intervention at that early, critical stage.
Secondly, they are ignoring the deep, corrosive psychological captivity.
The system remains blind to the profound, cumulative, and often irreversible psychological damage that traps survivors long term. By not recognizing psychological abuse, the law implicitly validates the controller's minimization of their actions, suggesting the abuse only counts when it is visible on the skin. This further gaslights the victim by denying their reality.
And most critically, Tennessee is ignoring the patterns that predict homicide.
This is the highest stake, and this is why this is a life-saving intervention. Decades of research consistently links severe, escalating patterns of coercive control, especially involving financial deprivation, threats against children or pets, and extensive monitoring to a dramatically increased risk of domestic homicide. If the law ignores this recognized predictive pattern, it is ignoring the primary indicator of lethal danger in a family.
So if we recognize that the isolation, the monitoring, and the financial control are the true danger signals, then the law has a duty to intervene there.
Absolutely. And the current law is ignoring the lived reality of thousands of survivors seeking help and validation. Modernizing the law is not a symbolic gesture. It is a profound, preventative, and life-saving intervention that provides a tangible legal tool for courts and survivors where currently there is only silence, denial, and systemic invisibility.
It provides the legal mechanism for necessary interruption before the control escalates into physical crisis or tragedy.
The definition itself is the safety mechanism. #outro.
This deep dive has revealed Tennessee's choice ahead, and the choice is stark. The state can continue to cling to an outdated legal fiction, pretending that domestic violence is only a physical event requiring a police report and visible injury. Or it can join the rapidly growing coalition of states that recognize the fundamental proven truth. Abuse is a sophisticated, systemic pattern of domination and capture.
And this essential reform, as detailed in our sources, requires more than just goodwill. It requires education and relentless advocacy. It will not happen quietly or automatically. There will be legislative resistance rooted in outdated legal philosophies.
And this is where the detailed knowledge you've gained in this deep dive becomes relevant to you, the listener. We've broken down the definitions, detailed the failures through a stark case study, and provided the explicit six-step roadmap for modernization. That knowledge now needs to be paired with action, whether it is raising awareness in your community or reaching out to lawmakers.
The coalition needed for this legislative change must be broad, informed, and vocal. This includes survivors whose authentic voices validate the need for change, therapists and advocates who provide the clinical expertise on the patterns, social workers and legal professionals who understand the systemic failures, and every resident who believes in safety and justice and demands that the law protect its most vulnerable citizens.
Our deep dive reveals that the legal truth about coercive control is already known and operational elsewhere. The challenge for Tennessee is bringing that established truth out of the shadows and integrating it into state law.
And as a final provocative thought for you to consider as this legislative discussion moves forward, we noted that Step 2 of the roadmap requires specifically recognizing tech-enabled surveillance in the statute. Given that technological control, GPS data, phone records, message metadata leaves highly specific, often time-stamped, and irrefutable digital footprints. What specific, concrete role will the recognition of tech-enabled surveillance play in proving these otherwise invisible patterns in court? And how rapidly must Tennessee courts adapt their evidence standards to rely heavily on that digital proof? This shift from bruise photography to metadata analysis will revolutionize domestic violence litigation.
A compelling question that highlights the need for not just legislative change, but a complete judicial transformation. Thank you for joining us for this crucial deep dive into legal modernization.